When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Hey there, Friday fans. We know how much you enjoy the movies. Enjoy grabbing your Friday merchandise and interacting with the Friday family, whether it be at conventions or during our particular watch-alongs. Well, when you're looking to get yourself masks, why not check out our friends over at Camp Blood Customs out of New York State and order your specific custom mask from any of the films. All orders are made specifically. Your needs and wants are. Make sure you find Camp Blood Customs on Facebook, Instagram, and all over social media and order yours today. Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Crock, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Hi, my name is Ariel Piper, daughter of the legendary Rowdy Roddy Piper and sister of the less legendary Colt Tomb. And you are listening to Crazy Train Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. As many of the listeners know, as a former history major that I am, but still try to stay current as I pour myself a drink for Thursday, since this is our first Thursday event, I figured why not go old school wrestling territories. Now, many wrestling fans that listen to us are of the younger persuasion, but we thank you anyway. But I always think it's good to go back to our history, even if it's just to learn from our mistakes. Well, why not the territorial promotions in which today's current products, you can kind of sort of say that we have that now with AEW, Impact, WWE, yada, yada, yada. But we have a heavyweight panel here, and we're going to talk about all things under the territorial umbrella, which the NWA, for most people that may or may not know, started in the late 40s after World War II. But we will get into all this. So let me go ahead and introduce our panel. And this is going to be fun for me to get everybody's perspectives, because everybody is in different parts of the country and even internationally, because why not go for the heavy hitters? First panelist, Dr. Mike Lano, who you've heard on the show before. He is a writer for several websites and been a photographer. He has been featured in many different projects currently, such as Dark Side of the Ring A&E biographies, MTV, Reels. He's been associated with the Cauliflower Alley Club as the board photographer since '87. Dr. Mike, hello.
Hey, everybody. Well, I kind of co-host at least the wrestling shows with you.
Yes.
But I have to salute you, Jonathan, because I didn't have any part. I sort of helped you with maybe the topics, but you got all of these heavy hitters, these great historians from Bertrand and, well, I'll let you go on. Brian Solomon. It doesn't get bigger than the folks we have.
So we will go to that gentleman now, as you speak. Bertrand Hebert. He is you've heard him on before. He has written several heavyweight books as well with his partner Pat, and even solo stuff as well. The latest thing that I saw solo of Mr. Herbert's is the Accepted Pat Patterson book, but he's also been involved with the Mad Dog Maurice Vachon story, Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs. He was also involved with Pat with The Eighth Wonder of the World, the true story of Andre the Giant. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining.
Good evening. Thank you for the invite. Yes, Andre the Giant was actually the last book that we had out about 2 years ago now. I have another one just in French for a local star here, but that just came out. But for the English-speaking fan, Andre the Giant, the Eighth Wonder of the World is our latest outing.
I've been bugging Bertrand Hebert, Carpentier. I would give anything for a Carpentier book.
I second that.
I'm with you.
But yeah, since he's here solo, I wanted to say solely he was involved with Pat Patterson's book. That's why I put that out front. But you just heard another panelist here who we had on a couple months ago, Mr. Brian R. Sullivan, who is an educator and author of several books on sports entertainment. He is a regular contributor to Pro Wrestling Illustrated and Inside the Ropes. He has his own podcast as well. And 7 years he was an editor over at WWE Magazine. But some of the books he was involved with were Pro Wrestling FAQs, WWE Legends. But his latest book that you might be aware of is the original Sheik's book. So, Brian, thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. Yeah, it's Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real-life story of wrestling's original Sheik. Quite a mouthful.
Yes. The next gentleman, who I've known since probably the longest out of everybody, Mr. Nikita Breznikov. I've known him since we were joking days on the East Coast in another profession. He is an author and historian as well. His book is When It Was Real, which is available through Crowbar Press. And he focused on the Northeast as well. Nikita, how are you?
Beautiful. Happy to be here. Great people. Thank you.
Absolutely. And our final panelist, he is a writer, researcher, historian, and a lecturer on Victorian English crime. And things like Jack the Ripper murders, and has a podcast of his own. And he is also from the wing capital of the world, in Buffalo, New York. But his specialties, I know, are being in boxing history, and his partner in crime for his latest book, The Wrestler's Wrestler, brought him back into the wrestling field. Mr. Brian Young, how are you?
I am great, and I'm so glad you didn't say, and the reason I said a heavyweight panel, Brian Young, because I saved the big fat guy for last. But no, it is such a pleasure to be on, and everybody on here, I'm big fans of all of yous. Mike, I know we email back and forth quite a bit, but
we talked.
Brian, I got to tell you something. Blood and Fire is my go-to book of the year.
Wow.
Bertrand, I loved The Eighth Wonder, but that's last year. And my go-to book last year was The Wrestlers, Masters of the Craft of Professional Wrestling, with The Eighth Wonder being second, but Blood and Fire, just bravo, Brian. That book is amazing.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That was my labor of love. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Right.
I watched all that stuff.
Pedro Martinez, Johnny Powers.
Yep.
Well,
I
before
got
we get
some
into
Pedro
anything,
Martinez stories. Martinez never could.
Yeah, Pedro Martinez.
Yeah, it was weird. He wouldn't pronounce it Martinez like Luis, but the Hispanic way.
He was trying to blend in. What can you say? Back
He
in
owed a
those
lot
days.
of those boys money. Is the
Yep. Maybe that.
well, like I said, we're going to be talking the territories, and obviously, this heavyweight panel has different perspectives from different territories, and obviously, they are well versed in everything. But I want to start with a breakdown of territories and locations, talking about some of the most influential promoters, locations, and whatnot. But before we get into that, I think, or as we get into that, I should say, and I want to have Dr. Mike start. We lost a heavyweight in terms of promoters and wrestlers last week in Mr. Enoki. So, being that you're my Japanese guy, what can you say about the gentleman?
Let me just preface this quickly, saying that the territories is a complex. There's a lot of meat here, which is why that's terrific. I've only seen some screeners. Obviously, I watched the full episode on Memphis. They're having part 2 on the Andy Kaufman thing. I thought it was terrific because that's all you need. You just need the boys at a round table. And maybe Memphis is unique because the best storytellers, other than Bill Dundee, were at that table, including Lawler and Jerry Jarrett and Dutch and Jimmy Hart and Jeff. You may not be able to find that unless you assemble, like for Mid-Atlantic, Flair, Steamboat, Sarge, David Crockett. That's probably all that's left, maybe Jake. But getting to Enoki, and I have to speak at Gene LaBelle's memorial. It's an invitation-only thing, only because it's a small venue, his old dojo, this weekend. But the parallelisms, I was asked to be on Busted Open twice. All of you guys, especially Brian and Bertrand, I think, have been on Busted Open to talk about Enoki twice this week since his passing. It was cool that the Hunter regime, Triple or WWE, mentioned that he was a sort of outlaw, but he was a champion. Backlund dropped clean to him in Japan. But Enoki and Gene LaBelle are inextricably linked. I'll get into that later if we have time, because Enoki would send guys very quickly after he started New Japan, December 72, which we can get into. We've got to consider Japan, and obviously Canada is part of all of those great. I mean, there were a zillion great promotions and offices in Canada. A lot of folks don't even talk about the Maritimes or the Montreal War, the Vachon's Rougeau, or Winnipeg, Tomco. So much great stuff there. But Enoki, getting back to that, he would send guys either that were way green, like a Mr. Seiki in 74. He sent him to our office for Gene de Finesse. He then sent him to Leroy McGurk's territory, where he became a tag champion. This was a clumsy, horrific jobber in 73, 74 for us. Who does he become later on but Mr. Pogo for FMW and some of the hardcore promotions of Japan? All thanks to Gene and Enoki initially. And there were so many others. Gene would finesse. Enoki would send, obviously, Alan Coage, Bad News, and later Judo Chris Adams, who Gene had finesse and friendship and closeness with those guys, and he would get them ready for their New Japan tours in turn. So it was a two-way street. There were many, many others. So a young Tetsumi Fujinami was sent in for Gene to finesse before he even appeared on our TV or our Olympic Auditorium big venue shows. Ricky Choshu came in. But Enoki, it's so hard to encapsulate all of him, but the guy is irreplaceable promoter. It'd be like Vince Sr. and Vince Jr. in one body combined with Lou Thez or maybe, I don't know, many other folks. I mentioned Lou Thez because Enoki, here's something people, at least on Busted Open, hadn't thought about. He was such a Thez mark. When he started New Japan, the two guys he went to, as all of you know, to give his promotion credibility. They were on most all of his tours the first year, 14, 15 months, Thez and Carl Gotch, before he would bring in the show busy, not hooker shooter types, and Johnny Valentine, Tiger Jeet Singh. He was able to get Abby over from All Japan, and obviously Johnny Powers and Pat Patterson in '74 and stuff. But he was such a Thez person and wanted that strong style that Thez and Gotch were able to give him that credibility, whereas Babu was pretty much continually using the Ricky Dozan guys for All Japan, that he wore. He mimicked Thez's beautiful robe. He had a silk robe with a colorful towel around his neck. And he would, in turn, so he took that from Thez. He passed it on to Dragon Tatsumi Fujinami, who in turn passed it on to, and they worked with Okada of today, wears the same thing. So those four guys there. But that's just scratching the surface, the Ali thing. So Gene LaBelle, they were so close. Gene from 63 on, whenever Enoki would come in, he came into our territory more so than he would later on and try WF and WWF. Enoki was like a regular fixture. So from 63 on, Gene would always tell Cal Eaton, his stepfather, I'll go pick up, Kanji from the airport. And that's what he did. And in turn, Gene and Enoki verified this, that Enoki helped teach Gene Japanese. And he was the go-to guy, the guy he trusted to be the ref, the actual conduit, communicator in the Ali fight, which, went south. And Gene had a lot to say about that. So Enoki's irreplaceable from the 1996 World Wrestling Peace Festival in Los Angeles, which actually led to the 2 days, the bigger, and that's what Enoki called it initially, the Peace Festival in North Korea, the 2-day thing, that entity, which apparently there's no footage of the whole show, which Eric Bischoff was saying the other day really should be watched. Somebody should have that footage, but there is no replacing, I'm sure you guys would have a lot to say, there's no replacing Antonio Inoki for all of the stuff that he did. He wasn't a perfect person. He had, 9 lives. I'm sure a lot of you guys, Bertrand and Brian, can talk better if we had more time on Inoki's 9 lives, some of his failures. He had backers and all of this stuff. Something of note, of interest, if I can squeeze this in, is that Bruno told me, and any of you guys that might have talked to Bruno regularly, he told me and other guys like another historian, Ed Gurria, the Phantom, that he initially was sought out by Vince Sr. initially wanted Bruno Ali. He couldn't find the financial backers. And Inoki and all of his folks, mostly Brazil and Argentinian money marks, got behind that. And that's how it got switched to that. And then when Vince Sr. saw like the advance for the closed circuit around at least the Northeast wasn't doing the numbers that he wanted, he was getting frantic. That's when they brought in the idea of the Andre Wepner, so having a live card. And that's when Vince Sr. went in there against both Carol Sammartino and Bruno's doctors, begging him to, take the halo off from the accidental broken neck from Stan Hansen and do the Hansen match. And it took a lot of cajoling and all that stuff because the doctors kept saying, no way should he leave this hospital at all, let alone get in a ring and maybe pitter-pat with Stan Hansen for that thing. So, but what an incredibly unique person. I'll shut up. Does anyone else want to talk about Inoki or their?
I would love to point out that I might be lucky enough to be one of the only people on this panel that has written about the Enoki Ali fight from both sides, from the boxing side and the wrestling side, primarily from the boxing side. And I was I wouldn't say close friends, but close acquaintances with Angelo Dundee, Ali's trainer. So I got all the dirt on that fight from that side. The Bruno rumors, all those other rumors, I hate to say, were rumors. Ali never had any negotiations with Bruno Sammartino, never had any with Terry Funk, which is where they claim it originally started. Terry Funk challenged him. It all started with Inoki, who publicly challenged Ali. Ali needed the money. He was an XL. They begged him not to do it. According to Dundee, it was supposed to be a work. And when Ali got there a few days before, he found out they were going to double cross him. That's why it turned into what it did. And that's why there's that weird, and I write about it in The Wrestler's Wrestler, that nobody involved on either side could tell you what the rules of the fight were, because they kept changing them. Every day they were adding or taking away rules.
Freddie Blassie was there for a lot of the so-called planning, whatever. That's a mess too, according to Fred.
Yeah, and they said no one knows what the actual rules were. But Ali, they were agreeing, and Ali was going to drop it. Ali was going to take the fall.
That's
for
crazy.
For the money, because he needed the money. And he figured, wrestler, Japanese guy, no one's going to care or know. Because Ali loved wrestling. You got to remember, Ali credits Gorgeous George for inventing Muhammad Ali. Right. I mean, that's where he took the character from.
Now, why he died on the Vine was because, I can tell you, because I was a kid in '76 as a fan, we didn't really know much about Enoki. Ali we loved. I mean, that stopped the world. Ali and Frazier was a big deal. But it's like, we didn't have cable in Baltimore. New York, they had it. So you didn't see a lot of Enoki. And it was dying, literally. And that's when they did go to the hospital. And I did know Bruno well. Today's his birthday, by the way. Yeah. And he said he should have never done it. Years later, it came back to haunt him. He should have never got out of that bed. But they said, stay in the hospital bed, Bruno, but don't worry about it because the company will be gone when you come back. And he had to do it.
We should bring this back to the territories, but maybe even Bertrand, because I didn't know what was happening up in Canada where they showed it. Most of the territories tried to beef up the closed circuit where the fans were paying, so they would come in for Los Angeles. Say my two home base territories shooting ringside for the program, LA and San Francisco. They had the closed circuit. You went to our venues, LA, the Olympic Auditorium, which is our crown jewel, San Francisco, and for Northern California, the Cow Palace out of all of Roy Shire's venues. They had matches prior to that, typically, depending on the territory, 3 to 4 max. Then they would show the footage of the 3 main ones, the Wepner, Andre, obviously, the Andre, and then Bruno and Hansen. But let me throw to Bertrand, and obviously Jonathan is the host, but were the say in Montreal and Toronto and Calgary, et cetera, do you know if they had live matches, or were they showing the thing up there too, the whole Enoki?
In Montreal, there was no showing of the Enoki match. The territory was in a very bad period at that point. There was no one strong enough to try to present that. So there was no live show to beef it up or to make it an event per se. So I don't know about the other territory, about Toronto or what happened in those places.
Let me just spit out. So I bring us back to the territories for Jonathan, because I lived them. That was my bucket list. I didn't get to go to all of them. And Calgary I didn't get to go to until 95 when I was hired to be the photographer for Stu's 80th birthday. So they had a big show for the fans, but then they had a private family party. But I got to stay at the mansion for 2 nights. I finally got to see Calgary wrestling and blah, blah, blah. But the territories, it's debatable. I don't know if we're going to include like IWE in Japan. There were 3 in Japan when we're talking classic territories. That was AWA affiliated, obviously New Japan, All Japan. But, there were so many, and there was X amount under the NWA's wing with Munchnick. But for example, a highly regarded one few talk about is the World Wrestling Alliance in Los Angeles. That was Cal Eaton and Jules Strongbow. They had a world champion, a tag champion. They put the strap, speaking of Enoki, on Ricky Dozan, his trainer, twice, and he would defend it. And that basically helped him create his promotion, JWA, JWF in Japan, with the help of like Blassie and the Duseks, and obviously a little later, Dick Beyer as the Destroyer, and Thez helped out. So for all of you, I could throw to, say, Bertrand and Brian, are we going to group the 3 Japanese territories? Are we going to group Australia, Jim Barnett, Mark Lewin? Are we keeping it solely to, obviously the Mexico, UWA, and Paco Alonso Luderoth? Are we going to just say Canada and US as what we're focusing on?
Well, I was actually gonna, if I could step back in here, Mike, is since we've been talking a little bit of Canada as well, and Mrs. Lano in the background. Hello, she popped in, but I wanted to stick with the Canadian offices as well. We can throw Mexico and all in there as well, as you were asking, but Montreal
there's a global family of territories. Most people just think of
yes.
the US. That's not correct. We cannot forget.
Because every Sunday in Toronto they would have AWA, WWWF, and NWA, so it's perfect.
Yeah. Exactly. But Montreal wise, and obviously from the book that Bertrand and Pat put out, which is the first time I got connected with those guys. They had the infamous long time rivalry of Grand Prix and International for a while there. Toronto was a big deal. But influential wise, how big was Montreal and the lasting impacts of those territories in particular?
Well, I mean, we could be there for hours speaking just about Canada and the different offices there. So, I mean, if we want to take Montreal as an example,
and full disclosure, before you get into that, full disclosure, when I asked him to join us, that was the first thing he said to me. We could be I showed him some of the notes that I had so far, and he said, man, we could be here for 7 hours just on all that. But go ahead.
So, I mean, as far as Montreal, after the Quinn era, I mean, like any other territories, there was a little bit of a downturn until the All-Star Wrestling with the Rougeau started, and then it was followed by Yvon Robert and the Vachon starting the opposition of Grand Prix Wrestling. And then, Montreal at that point was drawing 2 million people on television watching the boat shows. So that was a lot, and it's the golden age as far as the getting the eyeballs on the product, which is always key into of those territories back then. I mean, Gino Brito told us that once he finally got television steady in Montreal, it took 6 months, and then they saw a turnaround at the gate. So that gives us a little idea. And I mean, and that war between Grand Prix and All-Star, I mean, that brought Andre the Giant to North America, where he got his start with Grand Prix. And then Andre was the greatest attraction for the territory system, because those territories were their own little bubble of reality. And there was no interconnection. It was very hard for fans, or except for the extremely dedicated fan, to get news and get footage or anything from any other territories back then. So when Andre was showing up, nobody knew what happened in other places, and they could repeat program, they could repeat ideas with different other players with Andre, and Andre was that perfect star, because as much as he was a draw, and everybody wanted to see him, if he was going to be there every week or every taping or every big show, well, he would have lost something. But when Andre came to town, Sheriff was in town, and everybody could not miss that show. I mean, as far as Gino was explaining to us, I mean, even by the early 80s, it made a huge difference for a territory to bring Andre on top for a big show, let's say Easter Monday or Christmas show, or all those big shows from the territorial day. So that's a glory period. And, as much as we would like for it to return, even if we consider All Elite a bubble, and WWE another bubble, even NXT another bubble, and Japan, New Japan a bubble, and all that, there's still a connection. It's easy. You can, in 2 clicks, see everything you want to see almost. If it's not on YouTube, it's on New Japan World. If it's not there, it's on the WWE network. And at some point, I'm sure All Elite and Ring of Honor product will be available in the same fashion. So it is different. It's the toothpaste out of the tube. It's never going to go back It is what it is. It's fantastic for people who lived it. That's always my answer. What's the best wrestling? It's the one you saw when you first started to love wrestling. So for us, it's the territory day. It's the first thing that we saw.
Well, why I'm thinking of it, because we're talking the territories, obviously, folks. You would have firsthand acknowledgement of this. As far as Canadian wrestling and such, how much of an uptick would you say there has been as far as viewership and such when you have guys like Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens and stuff, probably from the Montreal area and Canada itself, helped the product and the fanship up there?
Obviously, it made a big difference. I mean, there had not been French WWE on television for decades. And then, WWE is back with a French team announcing for Monday Night Raw. And that's directly because there's a Sami Zayn and there's a Kevin Owens there. And it's special. I mean, even the last show here, I mean, both Kevin and Sammy shared a moment off camera and the crowd. I mean, it's the territory system once again. I mean, it's the local hero. That's exactly that. I mean, it's the same thing when Georges St-Pierre became a big star in the UFC, or when Jacques Villeneuve, the son, became the world champion in Formula One. I mean, those are our guys. So locally, I mean, it's much like, as far as Quebec goes within Canada, it's a lot like Japan or Mexico. It's much closer to that as far as the territory than the rest of Canada, which has become pretty much, an extension of the United States as far as the wrestling product. Our local guy still make a huge difference in how the business is perceived and the opportunity the business will receive from locally, because there is local star that outside of the wrestling.
Don't forget PCO. He's killing it. But Jacques, for decades, once International went away, he would have these shows and they would draw the biggest gate for any non-WWF, WWE. And Jacques did that consistently as fundraisers, and that was huge globally.
Well, yeah, he managed to pull out Rabbit out of his hat for a long, long time, based on the family name. He's the last Rougeau. And to this day, in the last year, he resurrected that. So much smaller, but he still resurrected that. So that's what Jacques does. He's a great seller.
Mm-hmm. You mind if I jump in and ask Bertrand a question? When I was researching my book, I was talking to the Baron von Raschke, and he was telling me how, Mad Dog Vachon took him up to Montreal, and he was still green. Mm-hmm. But he took him up to Montreal because, hey, you look like a good German, we'll be a good tag team, the whole Mutt and Jeff thing. And he said the territory exploded when they got back there. And it was in a lull, and it just blew up so big that people started coming from all the other territories to work Montreal because the crowds got so big so fast.
I mean, they did strike lightning in a bottle when he brought the Baron to Montreal as his partner. Baron moved there. I think his first daughter was born in Montreal. He has fond memories of Montreal. And basically, I mean, what stopped originally that run was the Mad Dog Vachon car accident. Yeah. From there, I mean, the Baron came back on a regular basis, and when the Grand Prix All-Star War started, I mean, the territory was literally on fire for 2 years. But I mean, that's a great example of a guy who got to start here. I mean, the list is long, from the Baron to even Yokozuna getting some early shots here in Montreal as Kokina, to we had Alofa who became Rikishi, and we all of those guys. You can go back. I mean, Toshiaki Kawada wrestled in Montreal in the towards the end of '86 with the international wrestling. So you never knew who you were seeing and what they were about to become. So it's that was also one of the beautiful things from the territory days, is that by the time that everything went national, you ended up with guys that you had seen here that became your guys that were making it in the national stage.
And I have one more quick thing for you before we move on to another territory. Being from Buffalo, I need to hear someone with the Quebecois accent say, "Let's go Sabres."
Let's go Sabres.
Let's go Mets.
Let's go Sabres.
Jesus.
Come on.
Let's go Sabres. I don't know. Avoy les sabres.
Oh, hell. But I didn't know how we're going hockey, but that's a whole nother show for another day, that's for sure. And I hope we can get Nikita and Brian involved here as well. Brian Sullivan.
Yeah.
And obviously there's Brian's book on the Sheik with Detroit, and obviously Nikita grew up in the New York territory, being he was in Baltimore and such. Mike's in California, and he was talking about Mr. Enoki in Japan and such. But what other territories would you say were major in being influential for where the product went and has eventually became?
But you mean promoters? I could just throw out there
promoters, territories, anything.
Well,
I would say territory.
Munchnick at the top, and I'll let you guys spit out the rest.
All right, now see, for the Northeast, forget Madison Square Garden. We all know about that. Boom, beautiful. But I was working for a bond company in 1977, and the Capital Wrestling Corporation bond came through. Vince McMahon's the president, Willie Gilzenberg, Phil Zacco. They were all under the same banner, but like Phil Zacco ran Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia. You could do whatever you wanted within reason. You didn't change any of the major titles. But we would get feuds in Baltimore, like Ernie Ladd against Professor Tanaka, because they had a blow up in a tag match. Nobody else knew about that. Again, pre-internet, unless you had a telephone. And if you made a long distance call, your parents would break your neck because it was so expensive. So you didn't get information. So they could do that, keep Baltimore happy. Like Bobo Brazil, when we had Pedro as champion, it was great, but he wasn't drawing in Baltimore. So for that summer of '73, Phil Zacco brought in Bobo Brazil. He really wasn't in the territory, but he brought him in from Detroit. He would run Baltimore once a month, and it was fine. Then you would have, with people up in Boston, would do their thing. No big deal. Abe Ford would do his thing up in Boston. It was still part of the same banner, but it was, you're going to do your own little thing up in Boston. Bruno was running Pittsburgh at the same time, before, believe it or not, when he became champion. He was actually in Indianapolis as tag champion with Dick the Bruiser, and things were so bad with Pedro, and I'm not knocking him, I loved him, especially as Intercontinental champion, but things just weren't working. So Bruno's like, what the hell? I'm in Indianapolis. I got a nice thing on. It's like, yeah, but we need you to come back. So it was so hard for him. He takes the belt December 10th, and he's still tag champions in Indianapolis with Dick the Bruiser. And then it's like, he's just running around like a wild man trying to make it all connect. And when you say territories, that's what brought us the Valiant Brothers, because Dick, it all started, and this gets a little convoluted, but the Bear Man, he heard from Bobby Heenan about, they knew Jimmy Valiant, but this guy, Johnny Valiant, working as John Sullivan at the time, he said, I think he'd be good to team up with Jimmy. So Dick's working Pittsburgh with Bruno in a tag match. It was September the 7th of 1973. And he said, I'll be there, bring this kid in. He was Pittsburgh oriented, and we'll do like a trial. We'll give him an audition. So they get in together, and I've got a clip in my book. It's got John L. Sullivan, Jim Valiant, and there they are together. And it was so good, Dick the Bruiser said, you're coming back with me to Chicago next week. And off they went. And then I think when Bruno got to working with them in Indianapolis, they showed up in WWF in March, and the rest is history. So those territories, when they worked together, even though, again, they were under one banner, but you could do your own little thing as long as it was okay and you didn't stray too far from storylines. It was beautiful. And we, the fans, were so happy for it and benefited from it. It was great.
Well, the way that go on, Brian, were you going to say something?
Well, I was actually going to bring it to you, believe it or not, because I was going to say, to me, when I think of the territories, in my mind as a historian goes to the NWA banner with all their territories, and then the WWWF or Capital up the Northeast, Vern having his thing in the Midwest. And the territories of under the NWA banner were so great because, like Nikita said, you could send people to other places to work on who their gimmick was going to be, what their gimmick was going to be, learn the trade. If you trusted each other's promoters, Johnny Valentine got his son up to Detroit to work with the Sheik to learn the business as, come on, what was his name?
Babyface Nelson.
Babyface Nelson.
Yeah,
but later in Buffalo, he teamed with Donnie Fargo as Johnny Fargo, the Fargo brothers.
As Johnny Fargo, exactly.
He went into Dallas once Johnny had the accident, and Johnny managed him as his brother. He didn't want. He was managing him for Fritz as his brother, not his legit son. But in Buffalo, here's an interesting story. Very quickly, I can do this fast. Johnny Powers and Pedro Martinez promoted the NWF, sort of working, but also at times at war with the Sheik, but traded most of the talent in Ohio and the Buffalo promotion. And they did the 3-ring supercard of wrestling. Ask me and Napolitano about that one. That made all of the magazines, which is how we got our info because we couldn't make phone calls. But Johnny Powers, the promotion NWF going downhill in 74, he sells his singles and his tag titles, NWF World and NWF World Tag Team titles to Enoki. They would later be renamed the IWGP titles. So Enoki takes it from Johnny Powers directly in a New Japan ring. The tag titles were dropped by two guys who had never, and Bertrand is going to laugh at this one, who had never even teamed before, but they were billed as NWF World Tag Champions. They brought them in to LA so Enoki and Sakaguchi could take the straps off them, film it, and say they were the new, and it was renamed the NWF International World Tag Titles. So Johnny Powers, now living in Toronto, and Pat Patterson, never teamed before a day in their life. They put the straps on them. So it was like wasn't a phantom title change, but a phantom tag team dropping to Enoki and Sakaguchi in LA at the Olympic Auditorium in 74, oddly for no reason with Joe Louis as ref. You usually only brought in Joe Louis or Jersey Joe Walcott when there was like some major feud and you needed a special ref. But Joe Louis, the ref for that thing, undercard Pampero Firpo debuts for us. None of the marks knew who he was. He takes the title from Ernie Ladd. And that was one of those territory bullshit international year-long tournament. It was like Phantom Tournament. It's taken a Phantom
Rio de Janeiro.
No, that was because Pat Patterson told me the closest he ever got to Rio de Janeiro, when he wasn't asked by Vince, and Brian may know this, when he wasn't needed by Vince as Vince's number 2 guy in creative, et cetera, he was taking cruises once he lost his partner, Louis. He would take all these cruises just to sing karaoke. And so on a cruise near Rio, that's the closest he ever got. Never, that was bullshit. That was, I don't know why they couldn't just put the strap or do a tournament there and have Pat as champ. Why they had to come up with the Rio. But the NWF World and Tag titles renamed, those are what we know today as the IWGP Championships in New Japan. It's nuts.
Now they screwed up because they announced him on the August 27th card against Backlund. That was number 3 out of the 4-match run, and new Intercontinental Champion. And then they always announced that it happened September the 1st of 79. It's like, but they already announced it August 27th. So
wasn't that a way to turn him face? So, I mean, Pat was the perfect person to have that working man's championship put on him.
Later that year with Lou Albano is when they turned him face.
Okay.
But to my point, and what I wanted to ask Brian, if I could, was...
I don't know if you can. We'll see.
We'll see.
Give it a shot, Brian. What do we got to lose?
Exactly. When the NWA territories were all separate but working together technically. Obviously, a lot of them didn't get along with each other, but they all seem to work well with the Sheik, with Eddie Farhat, which is unusual because I don't think people liked him so much on a personal level. Why was he able to work with all the other territories on a business level, Brian?
Because he drew money. I mean, he made money everywhere he went, so they could hold their nose and book him. But he was not the most popular among the promoters. I definitely got the sense, even having access to some letters and things, which I didn't put all in the book because there's just too much stuff, that they kind of talked behind his back. They sort of all had kind of gripes with him. And in those days, especially, a lot of them weren't thrilled about the gimmick. Like, we all know how Muchnick basically banned him in St. Louis. He went on a rampage in a match with Pat O'Connor and things like that. But when it came time to make money, like I said, they would hold their nose because they knew that wherever he went, they could pack a house. They didn't even need a program. They didn't even need to announce a match. All they needed to say was the Sheik is coming. And just based on that, it was in a way similar to Andre the Giant, just this phenomenon where all you had to know was he's coming to our town. He's coming to our territory. So, I mean, how could you say no to that? If you look at, Meltzer's done this over the years, but like breaking down the year by year, who are the hottest box office attractions in wrestling, in the territorial era, for a lot of it, it's Bruno or it's the Sheik. And for the Sheik to be able to do that as a heel, especially, is a major accomplishment, because if you're Bruno, everybody's turning out because they want to see you win, right? They want to see you keep winning, keep winning, keep winning. With someone like the Sheik, they're coming out there because they desperately want you to lose, to get killed and destroyed, and it never happens. So he just goes from place to place to place, and people just keep this dream alive that he's going to lose one day, and he never does.
He was able to work with them all on a level of, as a promoter too, because people would trust him enough to send their talent up there to work with him.
Yes, there were a lot of people that got their start in Detroit, like you mentioned, Greg Valentine. Johnny Valiant also got a lot of opportunities early in his career from the Sheik. In fact, I think the story was, and Mike, you might have actually told this story of how, or maybe I'm trying to think of who it was. When I was writing the book, someone told me the story about how basically, everybody knows that Valiant, John Sullivan, I forget what his birth name was. He went to Bruno. He basically
worked for Bruno in Pittsburgh, because Bruno,
right,
guys like Johnny DeFazio, he was so unique in the guys that Vince Sr. would allow to promote his own town, because he was barely using, he didn't have that many Tri-WF Capital Sports guys. He had a lot of guys he was cultivating, and John L. Sullivan was already there.
Right. But Bruno kind of introduced him to Vince Sr., and then Vince Sr. basically sent him out to the Sheik for seasoning. And also, I think part of it too was the Sheik was booking these cards that were just monumental. Like, he would have, 12, 13, 14, 15 match cards at Cobo Arena at its height. And he was just always on the lookout for talent. So he was more than willing to give people a shot. I mean, you had the Hells Angels with the future Chris Colt being half of that team. So many people that got opportunities in the Detroit area. Dusty Rhodes.
His own gardener, right. He had working as JB Psycho. I told you this story.
JB Psycho, his gardener, who shockingly, the Sheik had so many people turn on him and like for real and try to run opposition and go to other places. And the hilarious thing is, one of these startups in his own backyard, I think it was the one that Mark Lewin was involved with, and Tim Brooks. There were a few of them. They got a ton of Detroit big time wrestling people to jump ship. They even got JB Psycho, the Sheik's own gardener, the man's gardener.
He was doing a Crazy Man act with bleached blonde hair.
Right. And he went and he jumped. But also another one that I didn't want to forget too, the Texas Outlaws, Murdoch and Dusty Rhodes. They got one of their first opportunities in the Detroit territories. They were NWA World Tag Team Champions in Detroit when they weren't, they weren't that big yet. That was one of the places where they got their first exposure.
One of the most famous managers of all time, Dr. Mike, the Grand Wizard, Ernie Roth. He started up there.
The nicest guy, Mr. Clean, his first identity, Abdullah Farouk the Weasel. He had his only wrestling match because I kept asking Dave, didn't he tag with Sheik or do anything where he wouldn't come into the ring? No, in LA, it was in San Bernardino, April of 1972, the Sheik and Abdul Farouk against the Tolis brothers, who were baby faces. And Ernie only got into the ring and had his clothes torn off at the very end of that match. But beloved, I don't think in today's crazy PC world, he could use the Grand Wizard title, but
no.
But
Brian, you know why the Sheik also drew money? Because we're nuts, and we knew there would be blood, and that's what we went to see. We
right, the fire, the violence, the blood sport.
Let me ask all of you guys though, for the territory. Let's just say pick the '70s territories. My pick for the two greatest '70s territories heels, in no particular order: Sheik and Killer Kowalski.
Ooh. Wow,
that's tough to beat.
George the Animal Steele too.
But he didn't work everywhere. I mean, Kowalski worked for Eddie Graham. People forget
Kowalski worked
everywhere. And then he came into us and took the book over for a little while in L.A. and Montreal.
But wait a minute, George got to start in Detroit. He started up there too.
And I shot the only time I got to Maple Leaf Gardens. I guess it was '74. Heel, Kowalski against the Sheik, which was incredible. Igor and Abby underneath that. Chris Tolis in the.
You got to throw in Mad Dog there.
I'm throwing in Mad Dog. I'm throwing in the Baron, and down in Florida, Buddy Colt. I don't think anybody drew heat like Buddy Colt did in Florida.
Here's a topic, because Eddie Graham wanted to put the bond. Now, here's a weird thing. So these guys, promoters, may not have gotten along, but they had to go to the NWA meetings. And later on, I think it was 77, 78 was the first time that Sam Munchnick and Vern Gagne, who were very close, and they were close also with Bob Geigel from Kansas City, they got Vince Sr. to finally come back, and he started regularly going to annual NWA Vegas meetings. However, so they all would get together there. Eddie Graham, before Bobby Shane and Buddy Colt were in that accident, he wanted to put the bond on either one of them. And that was the purpose of those meetings. You guys can get into it. But I just want to say, so you have them cooperating at annual NWA meetings, sometimes trading talent. You remember for Vince Sr., Eddie Graham, Vern, LaBelle were sending talent in. But when it was time to battle Vince Jr. in '84, those same promoters, guys like Bill Watts and Jerry Jarrett and Vern, and Fritz, they couldn't get along and cooperate and work together to battle. It's insane.
Well, they had no Sam Muchnick. That's a huge loss. I mean, he was the glue holding it all together. I mean, the reason he never stepped down, I mean, he hated being the president of the NWA. It was torture, but he viewed it as, if I don't do this thing's going to collapse. And he was right, because then it gradually, he sort of steps away in the mid 70s, and it just gradually starts to deteriorate. They even change how they're booking the world champion and the world title. They start hot-shotting. There's a lot of different things that Muchnick wouldn't have done if he was in charge. And then it's just ripe for the picking. They're so vulnerable, at that point.
First off, I kissed your butt over your book. Now I got to say, you just brought up the point I wanted to bring up, that the territory started to collapse after Muchnick.
Yes.
And for the audience who doesn't really understand that, who might not know what we're talking about, just super briefly, the promoters that ran the different territories in the NWA would actually vote on who the president was going to be and actually be the president of the whole organization. And Sam kept getting elected. Like Brian said, he didn't necessarily want to do it, but he kind of knew he had the responsibility to. Once he was out, and it did start to collapse, they lasted 10 years, well, a little more than 10 years without him, never drawing like they did.
Right.
Who do you guys, and I want all of you to answer this one, who do you guys think could have kept it alive had they taken it over from Sam?
It's a business of ego. So you have a bunch of promoters that all think they are the best, that they have the best ideas, then everybody else is an idiot. So you need a very special person to keep all of those guys working together and accepting, give me this, I'll get you this, and all of that. So was there really anyone that could bring them together? I mean, when they all thought that the other one was an idiot. And that's the same reason things are getting out of hand today. It's the business of ego. And the people who have a great success are the people who get kept their ego in check. And as soon as the ego takes over, that's where we have a problem. And I don't think there was any promoter left at that point. I mean, even Jerry Jarrett tried again with Vern and after that 84 attempt, and it still didn't work.
Well, it was never going to work with Vern.
That could have done that magic trick of, getting him working.
75, the IWA tried to beat Vince Sr. and they got crushed. Who was it?
No. I let me be real brief on that. It was Eddie Einhorn, who co-owned the Chicago White Sox. I shot a ton of that stuff. His bookers, from Pedro Martinez to George Cannon and Al Costello, but he tried taking on the NWA and Vince Sr. on his 3 outdoor stadium shows. He was birthed out of Annie Gunkel taking on the NWA Paul Jones, not the wrestler, but the promoter Paul Jones in Atlanta, when they disrespected and didn't help out when Ray Gunkel died on a show, her husband. So she took them on. She beat him for nearly 2 years. And Bruno and Ernie Ladd and other guys, Ox Baker, came and helped her out, but they were beating attendance-wise. So there is that. But I wanted to ask Bertrand, because I know Tunney came to the NWA Vegas meetings, but I don't know I know Stu did for several, not all of them, but I don't know if, say, any of the Montreal promoters, because they weren't really were there other maritime promoters?
Never members, but it's my understanding, and we've seen documents at the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame that seems to indicate that Rougeau would send someone, among others, and Schmidt, as kind of just a presence more than anything else, as far as being.
Because Rio Burke would come he came to X amount of them too from the Maritime.
But the territory was never a member of the NWA under any promoters. They were always working with everyone, either working with New York, working with Vern, or working with with the Toronto office. Or using their own connection to get some of the top stars into Montreal, but it never worked under the NWA banner.
And I should say, everybody who was anybody during that Montreal, Rougeau, Vachon territory, Grand Prix, also everybody who was anybody came through there. Bruiser, Blackjacks, you could go on and on. I mean, everybody was coming in there. And plus, Vachon's had in-house, Don Leo, Killer,
everybody,
amazing talent.
And by the 80s, I mean, we in Montreal with International Wrestling, we had world title matches with Bob Backlund, world title matches with Nick Bockwinkel, and world title matches with Ric Flair in a period of like 4 years. So, everybody came through Montreal. It seems to have been some sort of a territory where, everyone could come and go as they please without any full-time commitment by the promoter to any of the other organization.
Almost like Japan, in that it was kind of a thing, a bucket list. I want to work Canada. And look at Al Tomko's Winnipeg. He had more interpromotional matches. Martel Flair, Martel Bockwinkel. He had title versus titles there, even more so than Eddie Graham had in Florida with like Superstar Graham, Harley. So Winnipeg, very important and overlooked, an unusual territory because most people thought of it as an AWA outreach of Vern, but there was a lot of NWA, etc. talent on Winnipeg shows for a time.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because of the interconnection of today. It's hard to imagine where you can actually have, and New York was a great example, where part of the same territory could run their own set of angles or be, because of the bicycling of the tape, be late in certain towns on where the angle was or who the champion was. So that was one of the beauty of the territory at the time, that you could actually pull stuff like that, or bringing a star for a specific town in your territory because the promoter knew that he would draw. So it's a completely different era as far as that goes. And it's fascinating to look at it today because, that's unimaginable, basically, because of how everything has evolved.
And right, then I'll answer it.
Brian,
Bill Lott's going to take it over.
That after Sam finally retired, and he, as Brian really put it well, was the glue that held everybody together for as long as he could. Then we had Fritz, we had Eddie Graham, and Bob Geigel as president, and that's when stuff went downhill. But
and also you also had Jim Barnett now booking the world champion instead of, that was Muchnick's job. And even just the whole philosophy of how they booked the title started to change, where it became, you know, because Sam was always so concerned with the prestige of the belt and making it seem so important, and having these long titles reigns and having champions that could work babyface, or they could work kind of like a subtle heel style, not over the top, but just like a subtle style. Then it just became this model of, we're going to have this touring heel champion that everybody's going to hate everywhere he goes. That was really kind of a post Muchnick idea to book the title that way. And with Barnett, you were able to do things like, oh, since I also run Georgia, I'm going to do this quick title change with Tommy Rich just to boost my business up, because I control the title. So there were a lot more of like these personal interests being indulged that I don't think Muchnick would have stood for when he was in charge.
Well, that's what I meant. I mean, I don't think there was anybody that would have been able to run it the way Muchnick did. I mean, like Bertrand said, ego gets in the way.
Right.
I mean, I look at people that I thought might be good to take over. Bill Watts seemed to care more about keeping the business alive than his own personal territory and ego, but nobody could work with him because he'd beat the shit out of you.
Right. I have a crazy theory that I don't think I've ever spoken out loud, and I might get pilloried and chased out of this panel when I utter this, but I think in an alternate reality, let's say, because of his ambition and drive and forward-thinking attitude towards a changing business and his kind of natural leadership, if he wasn't a complete predator, totally out for himself and his own interests, I think that Vincent K. McMahon could have been the person to do that because of the kind of personality that he had. If he was the kind of person that didn't want to put everybody else out of business, if he took that energy that he had of how pay-per-view was going to work and how merchandising was going to work, and let me tell you something, if anybody that's been here has been in a room, when he walks in the room, he controls that room. Somebody like that could have done it if he was willing to use his powers for good instead of evil. He could have done it.
Second time, because Ted Turner outspent him and beat him into the ground, and he held his place because only one person was in charge of that company, and it was him. Everything went through him, and he waited. He was patient. And when they let those four young stallions go, Malenko, Benoit, Guerrero, I forget the fourth one right now.
Perry Saturn.
Saturn. It's because nobody was running that place. It was just all out of control. And it's like, you let them go. Are you simple? I mean, man, this is the future. And Vince just brought him in, and he took back control, and he never relented.
And in the beginning of his expansion, he was reaching out to all these territorial promoters, making deals and trying to play nice, but it was all kind of a subterfuge. So if what he was doing as a subterfuge had been genuine, if he really truly wanted to work with all these regional promoters and territories and let them control their territories and use kind of a shared pool of talent, if the pitches that he made to them were honest, I think he may have had a chance of actually doing that if he didn't have this all or nothing, zero-sum game kind of mentality.
Let me throw out something really quick. Muchnick, when he would take the summers off, nobody else did this. He would import other people's TV. He might have some All Japan TV, Detroit Sheik TV, Bruiser TV, AWA, even Vince Senior TV to replace his wrestling at the Chase when he wasn't taping. For a whole summer, he would take X amount of months off. The thing that Brian asked about what started killing it, and you remember the Funk Brothers sold to and Terry has said this wisely, we knew with the advent starting around 76, 77 of TBS and national TV, and that was World Championship, Georgia Championship, Ole Anderson, they saw the writing on the wall. So Dory and Terry, because Senior had passed, were the first to get out. They sold the territory to Mulligan and Murdoch. And the World Championship Wrestling before Vince got national TV was the thing, for good or bad, that slowly killed the territories, with guys like Don Owen, Portland, and Jarrett, and Puerto Rico and a few other, hanging on till the bitter end, because Roy Shire sold his territory. Then the houses were going down. It was January of 82. Then he goes and exposes the business to the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle, our most biggest newspapers in California, exposes the business knowing that Vern and Vince Jr., this was 82, were going to come in weeks after he closed. He already knew that, and he wanted to F it up for them, as he said on my TV show. Vince Jr. bought our office December of 82, Los Angeles, from Mike LaBelle. That is where the blue infamous, our second cage, but the Blassie Steele cage was used in WrestleMania 2, the blue one for Bundy and Hogan. That's where it came from. That was our Blassie Steele cage to replace our rickety, that almost fell down when Tolos and Blassie were in it, wood and metal cage. So the blue thing we used for a number of years, Piper and Chavo fought in it a million times, and Blassie and Tolos had a farewell tag match in that blue infamous cage. Vince buys our office, and then he'd already been promoting like C-grade house shows in San Francisco at the Cow Palace against Vern, at the Oakland Arena, started promoting in LA. And, but a whole year before he went national, I guess we would consider perhaps January 84, the point of, December 83, January 84, the point of Vince Jr. going national. I actually agree. I think, maybe an alternative universe Vince could have handled that. But we should just say, to at least answer one of John's questions on our outline, maybe have this panel come back. I'm just going to throw out and ask you guys, most powerful promoters, territories, obviously Sam Munchnick, Eddie Graham, Florida, Paul Bosch, we've not even talked about, the incredible Paul Bosch in Houston, Dallas for Fritz, Geigel in KC, Sheik, because he was booking Detroit and Toronto for a number of years, even though they ended up sadly going into the ground, but a number of years they were incredible. What other promoters do you guys see? Would you throw Don Owen in Portland in there?
I got a few that I'll list, but before I do, I feel bad because we all host shows, so we're all used to doing this. But let's go to our host. We haven't heard from him in a while. Before we answer that, you got any questions for us?
Well, I have one before, or I should say after you guys answer that question about promoters. And obviously I sent you guys some notes and stuff, and we can be, as Bertrand said, we could be here for hours and hours talking about the territories. But after you answer the question about the promoters, I'm curious to know, and I'm gonna combine a couple different things here, is with the territories in general, and you guys can take us in whatever direction you want. What was unique about the different territories at the time in presenting their product to the wrestling fan? And even we saw a little bit about it mentioned in the Memphis episode on Vice last night, in fans wanting to fight and attack the talent. But I want to show respect as well, because on that same episode, it was mentioned about, say, in quotations, outlaw promotions. We had famously the Paphos, but we also had somebody over in Vancouver at the time in Dean Silverstone. But there was other places along the way. So if you guys can throw that around a little bit besides promoters that Mike was asking, feel free.
I'll go first, and I'll do it real quick. So this could be like the template for all of us. Big time promoters, if you take Vince out of the equation, obviously you're going to talk about Eddie Graham, you're going to talk about Jarrett, you're going to talk about Muchnick, you're going to talk about Von Erich, and you're going to talk about Vern. As far as outlaw territories go, you can make the argument that the biggest outlaw territory of all time is Vern Gagne in the AWA. So, yeah, the Paphos are, when people say outlaw promotion, that's the first name they go to, are the Paphos, because how can you not? Because Randy was he's the Macho Man. Everybody loved the Macho Man. And anybody who's ever spoken for more than 2 minutes to Lanny just falls in love with him. And they
were sending their tape out. Terrible interrupting. They sent their tape out to places they never would ever tour. LA, San Francisco, Portland, and then they would do localized vignettes trashing the local talent. For San Francisco, they were trashing Roy Shire and Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens and Pepper Gomez. LA, Tola Splashy were long gone. They weren't even there. Portland, they were trashing guys at that point in 79, 80.
But for outlaw promotions, I'm going to say, technically, Vern with the AWA, as big as it got and as mainstream as it got, and it got the ESPN contract, it was an outlaw promotion because it broke away from the NWA. It wouldn't do business.
But I think the difference is,
go ahead. That's where I was going to leave it.
The difference with it, where I would not consider the AWA an outlaw, basically for a couple of reasons. Because first of all, they sort of had a special dispensation, like they were kind of recognized by the NWA, like, we're going to let you do your thing. We're going to give you this area. The difference too is, like, for a true outlaw, they're usually running, and this of course is nothing that would ever hold up in a court of law. It makes no sense at all. But in the weird world of wrestling, they're running in somebody else's backyard. They're running somewhere where you have maybe an NWA representative or somebody who's saying, hey, this is supposed to be my spot. Like, you can't run here. I'm the wrestling in this area. Who are you? Whereas with the AWA, they sort of had carved out their space. It's not like, and correct, maybe I'm wrong, it's not like the NWA was saying, no. Minneapolis, that's ours. You can't run there. Minnesota, that we have a guy that we want to run Minnesota. You can't do that. I don't think they were really doing that with the AWA. They were sort of like letting them have their thing in the same way that they were letting, Vince have his thing in the Northeast as well.
Well, I think because Vern was too big a star.
Yeah, Vince Sr. already had his thing, and then they decided not to recognize Thez anymore because of the Rogers match from, I believe, Toronto. And
61, correct?
Fred Kohler had Chicago, and Fred Kohler left with them.
Right.
We were all broke loose for Chicago.
Yeah, he was working with Vince, yeah.
Omaha, the Duseks, they recognized Carpante. LA with the WWA, they recognized Carpante as their first world champion. There were a few others. Boston recognized
Montreal.
Yeah, Montreal too. You're exactly right.
Now, the last part of the question, and then I'll pass it along, was what made the different territories so special? Wrestling is like every other sport or activity. Regions of the countries like things different ways. East Coast hockey is very different from West Coast hockey. And when West Coast hockey is played on the East Coast, we get pissed. Baseball. National League Baseball and American League Baseball are very different. Same sport, same game, but one is a strategy-based pitching game, one is an offense game. Wrestling, the territories all had different flavors. Like they said in that Memphis episode, they wanted the realism, the nasty, but kind of bizarre Detroit. They wanted the blood and the guts. Chicago initially wanted the most professional of horrible sentence structure for someone who's a writer. The most professional of the amateurs. They wanted the amateur legitimate shoot wrestling in their pros. Every territory had different tastes and different flavors, and they could run them that way.
And I also think you can't underestimate the fact that those flavors, those tastes, I really think were shaped by the promotions. I don't think it was anything like, yeah, you can say certain things like certain, fans in Philadelphia are nuts and bloodthirsty and all that. And you could say, but in Detroit, right, things like that. But I think that the promotions were shaping it. Like, for example, like Eddie Graham. Eddie Graham had a great love for the shooters and for the legitimate style. And so he kind of conditioned his fans to be predisposed to that because they were just like, okay, well, this is our wrestling. We turn the TV on. This is what wrestling is. In Detroit, I talked to plenty of people who grew up with Detroit wrestling, of course, writing the book, and they loved it and they would wax nostalgic about it. But you can talk to people from other territories that would say Detroit, forgive me, Dave Brzezinski and everybody else, that Detroit was garbage and they couldn't stand it because it was just blood and guts and people, hitting each other with chairs and 5-minute matches. And it was just a circus. And so it's like the fans were being trained to accept what it was. Like Madison Square Garden, you knew you were going to have a certain type of worker there. And guys knew that when they went to the Garden, they could make way more money and work an easier style at the same time, because that is what the fans were conditioned to accept.
But you got to know, each territory had a state athletic commission. If they were involved, you were screwed. You were kind of locked down as to what you could do. Maybe Detroit up in Michigan was wide open. You could get away with anything.
Yeah, they didn't have it. Some areas didn't have an athletic commission.
Maryland, you had to be careful. They were there. It had about 6 of those bastards sitting at the table all the time.
Let's ask Bertrand. Bertrand, I don't know about the commissions in Canada, and maybe go beyond Montreal. And also, when you guys posed that question, I said everything was unique because I got to travel, not all of them, but almost all of them, 95%, including Puerto Rico. Everything from the fans, the refs, the timekeeper, the TV, everything was unique, different, and fun. That was my life. But Bertrand, was that the rule where you guys heavily, say Montreal and beyond, Toronto, Calgary, the Maritimes, Winnipeg, Nova Scotia, were the commissions really heavily involved in shaping or limiting what the promoters could do?
I don't know about the other city as much, but in Montreal, the commission was there for until the mid '80s, basically until WWF came in and got away with them being a spectator and just collecting money, and then just disappeared as they became full entertainment. Before that, going back to Quinn, the promotion and the commission kind of worked together. In the Grand Prix All-Star War, I mean, Johnny Rougeau was closer to the Montreal Athletic Commission, and he could get away with things, and he could make sure that they would put some very big hurdle in front of the Vachon and Robert for them trying to, because the commission would only have jurisdiction on the island of Montreal. Anything outside in the province was, there was no commission. So that was also different. So for most years, the commission kind of worked hand in hand with the wrestling promotion, much in the same way that they worked with journalists with, brown envelope and, extra money on the side and things of that nature.
Yeah. Or, hey, you need a smoke break kind of deal. Hey, so they could pull off an angle.
And a lot of times the referees, obviously, where you had a state that was strict or had an athletic commission, the referees were employees of the commission. They were not, like today, a referee is talent. A referee is an employee of the wrestling company. They're just a talent. They're not an actual, referee. Whereas in those days, like I got to talk at length with Dick Kroll, who was, the iconic Legend. Madison Square Garden referee. And he talked about what a weird line they walked, because they had this divided loyalty. Like they worked for the commission, but they also were beholden to, let's say Vince or the Garden, and they had a certain things to uphold. And sometimes he told me they would even have to kayfabe the commission, because they couldn't let the commissions know how much they were in cahoots with the wrestling promotion. It was this really archaic thing. And he said how, they wouldn't know, this was great. He explained to me how, how, especially in these big matches at the Garden, the referees would always pat everybody down very carefully and slowly and do this whole ritual. He said that's where they were telling me what the finish was going to be or what the big spots were, because he had no idea, because the referees weren't allowed to get near the wrestlers backstage, and you had a commissioner representative there watching them. So they would just say, well, okay, look, so-and-so is going over, and watch out, we're going to do this big spot where we go over the top rope, make sure you're out of the way, like things like that. That would be going on while he was patting these guys down for foreign objects, supposedly.
Even though New York was pretty much like you're saying, they would give a little. When Lou Albano wrestled Snuka on his big comeback, he dropped his blade. He goes in his pocket and pulls out a straight razor. And Vince Sr.'s like, Lou, what the hell is wrong with you? You're going to lose me to Garden. You can't do that. I asked, and he was, like Lou, he's just slicing himself up. Because Vince and Gorilla Monsoon were doing the commentary. They blew it a little bit. They're like, Albano's going into that tunic he's wearing. And it's like, oh shit, he's pulling out a blade. What the hell, man? It's like, yeah.
I remember Rick Martel telling a story about that.
They have the toughest athletic commission. I think Jersey and New York, perhaps Philly.
Yes.
Or they had the strictest until 80s, 90s when it was Washington State and Oregon had, and Vince Jr. refused to tour there. It was just insane.
That's also why it was in New Jersey where Vince finally put his foot down in 88, I think it was, or 89, and said, look, wrestling is entertainment. You know, they went into a court and declared this, and it was specifically to get the New Jersey Commission off their back.
Well,
but
Dugan had a lot to do with that.
Right? But it rippled across the whole business, obviously, this great revelation that everybody already knew, you know, that pro wrestling is not a sport and shouldn't be governed by the state athletic commission.
That plays into what you said, though. Vince Jr. could have feasibly been NWA president, alternative universe, not out for himself and killing others, because he did that, and it helped everybody else out. No more having to pay ridiculous fees to the athletic commission.
That's what I mean. He was very forward thinking. That's what I mean. Like he was able. That's why he was able to beat all those guys, because he wasn't set in the mindset that they were stuck in. But like I said, if he had taken those abilities and used it in a constructive way, he could have led them all instead of killing them all.
His killing kayfabe by blowing the whistle on it, and to get the commissions off their back, did not help the business. People could say it didn't hurt it, but it did.
He wasn't worried about that. He was worried about his bottom line. He didn't care.
Well, but that's the thing. When you say, he took them off everybody's back, but he also destroyed the business for a lot of people.
I also don't know how sustainable it was. That's the thing. There's this thing where, like, how long could you keep it going, especially in an environment where it's not just Sam Mushnick going away. It's cable television. It's the idea of local television going away. I mean, by the time you get to the 90s, local TV is just infomercials.
And the boys texting finishes.
Right. And so now you have social media. In today's environment, I just think it would be absolutely impossible to maintain strict kayfabe in today's environment.
It was impossible once Vince took over, because WWF/WWE wrestling, and I hate to say it, and a lot of people get mad at me for saying it, is it was cartoon wrestling.
Sure.
Compared to the other promotions.
It was.
So no one believed it. I mean, except for little kids, no one really believed in it.
Well, that's why you also had the situation where when he started going into some other territories that had a different type of product and a more reality-based product where people believed, and they rejected it initially. Like that was happening in the Carolinas. It was happening in Georgia, where they were putting on shows and the crowd is chanting fake, which is hilarious when you think about it. But because from their point of view, this was much more obviously fake than the wrestling that they had.
When Black Saturday occurred, Nikita, when Black Saturday occurred, they still talk about it. Busted Open talks about it weekly. It's like the most horrible day in wrestling when they had the usual intro with Austin Idol and Stan Hansen, and then Freddie Miller introduces Vince Jr. and the ratings went down the toilet. It took a year, and then Oli got the time back. They repurchased it and blah blah blah. And when Oli had his early morning 6 a.m. Pacific time show, 9:05 Eastern, and Sundays was Bill Watts Mid-South, they immediately drew a whole ratings point and more than Vince's year there. It was just a different. People were used to athletic, not so perfect, pretty gritty, realistic wrestling in Georgia as many other places, Florida, Missouri.
People want to give Hogan the big credit for '84's expansion, but don't forget the Sheik and Sergeant Slaughter's big feud was going on. Vince let that run its course, and it was very bloody. But when that was done, then it was strictly cartoons. Piper was hot. He was getting away with a lot of good stuff too, where it was violence. The Sheik and Nikolai as a tag team, but then it was like, okay, now we're going to be, they didn't go PG, but they were getting close. It was silly.
Let's not forget about Nikita, and let's not forget about Snuka and his ankle in Morocco at the time, where Piper talks about that.
Oh, well, that was in '83. Yeah, that was definitely.
And remember the brilliance
to what you're talking
Senior,
about.
though. The brilliance of Vince Senior. He has a heel Iron Sheik walking back and a heel Sergeant Slaughter walking past them. They have a look and exchange. Vince Sr. hadn't even smartened Sarge, Bob Remus, that anything was going to come of that. And that's what turned Sarge and led to amazing business with Sergeant Slaughter and Iron Sheik. Not the real Sheik, the original Sheik, as pretty much everybody in Canada, when you say Sheik, they only think of Ed Farhat. They don't think of Iron Sheik. Let me throw something out to very quickly, we're probably getting to the close, that Paco Alonso used to come up and Salvador Luderoth before him. I think that was his father-in-law for CMLL. They would make all the NWA meetings from Mexico. They were the biggest, they're the oldest promotion in the world. They're like 83 years and counting, consistent with TV, older than even, Vince Sr. to Jess McMahon, blah, blah, blah. And they still have a ton of titles that are called the NWA Junior, the NWA Welterweight, the NWA Women's. So they still retain that original Sam Munchnick NWA they always had in the 70s, 80s. They have kept those title belts alive. Many of them the same original belts falling apart, which I think is incredible. And that is a testament to the territories, the value, the amazing territories. And all you young folks, I hope they'll watch Tales from the Territories. And I hope they can construct some panels. Just let the boys talk. That's all you got to do. You don't have, and have footage, have original footage, have Eddie Gilbert running over Jerry Lawler, knocking him over the top of the car. That's that series on Vice.
One thing I want to say about the Memphis thing after watching that episode, which I enjoyed very much, by the way, and you guys could tell me if I'm totally off base here, because I think I may be one of the younger people in here. No offense to anybody, but they talk about
got you beat.
When wrestling was real, Memphis being this very real, kind of realistic. I always thought, and especially from what I've seen and what I know about the territory, was that at the time they were looked at as one of the more ridiculous, and I don't mean in a bad way, but just like over the top, not realistic promotion. They had mummies and they had like Freddy Krueger. It
was a little later. That was in the early 90s when it went from CWA to USWA. Yeah, late 80s, early 90s. They went ridiculous. Before it was viewed as super gritty, and the thing that led to FMW in Japan, Onita, and throw in a little Sheik and ECW. But yeah, they were pretty good, solid, because they had everybody in the territories knew they had the highest TV rating in the country, maybe outside of whatever Tri-WF, because Vince Sr. had, crummy UHF station.
But they had huge ratings, but Brian's right. Memphis was run very strange. They had two bookers that would switch on and off every 6 months. And when Lawler was booking, Lawler was a fan of comic books. Lawler was a fan of old horror movies. And in the late 70s, Frankenstein was on the show. It was someone in makeup.
Well, we had that in LA too. And they went beyond Memphis in the ridiculousness of saying billing him with Jimmy Lennon Sr. And that's why he quit as ring announcer. He had to bill him, say he's from Transylvania. And the
right.
announcers.
Well, Jimmy had his boxing credibility to worry about.
Dude. Wait, Brian, do you remember that? The Frankenstein monster in LA in 1980? That's what really led to the slow death of our LaBelle territory. We had to sell to Vince Sr., who promised him he would have 10 years to be recognized as the local West Coast promoter for the WWF. That lasted a year.
Well, right. I've always heard that with Memphis, the attitude of a lot of other promoters was that they were exposing the business by doing some of the over-the-top outrageous angles that they were doing that I guess is now considered realistic. But when I think of reality or realistic wrestling, I think like St. Louis, I think Florida, I think, even like Georgia and the Carolinas, very believable style. I don't think Memphis, and that's not a knock on them. It's very entertaining, but I don't think reality when I think of the Memphis promotion at all.
No, and remember Vern Gagne as well as Bill Watts. They were like Eddie Graham. They were into the legit athletes. So we do have to give Bill Watts mega credit, and Leroy McGurk before him, because that's where Stan Hansen and Brody came out. It was Leroy McGurk who later, kind of in an aggressive fashion, took over the territory, the mid-southern territory, made it mid-south. And of course, Vern Gagne, guys, amateur greats like Dale Lewis, and even Johnny Powers started there from his amateur career in the AWA. So he had a lot of heavyweights, and Dick the Bruiser from football.
I was very lucky to grow up in where I did. First off, I love Buffalo because I'm a big fat guy. I like chicken wings. But I grew up. I'm like Brian. I think I'm one of the younger guys on the panel. Maybe the second youngest.
I'm 47, so I'll put it out there.
I'm 48, you bastard.
38.
Okay, there you go.
Get into your late 60s, you youngins.
But when I grew up, we got Buffalo and the area around here was one of the first in the country to get cable put in. So I was getting Georgia wrestling. I was getting Florida wrestling. I was getting Detroit wrestling in the late 70s. I was getting the WWF into WWF. I was getting the AWA. I was getting Portland wrestling on late night channels sometimes. Plus, I have a brother 5 years older than me who was the biggest wrestling nerd I ever knew growing up. So I saw everything. And the difference between then and now, I'll just stick to Buffalo, for example. When I talk to old timers in my area, they'll say things like, I always knew a lot of wrestling was fake, but I would go there every week and see Yukon Eric and Ilio DiPaolo, and they were real.
Right. Or Bruno was real, right?
Bruno was real.
Right.
Now, Yukon Eric was such a gimmick. He lived in Buffalo. He died in Tonawanda, New York, which is actually the little tiny city I was born in. He would drive around in a convertible in the middle of winter with no shirt on because he was from the Yukon. He never broke kayfabe. So kids and adults would see him around Buffalo with no shirt on in the middle of a Buffalo winter. Okay, this is insanity. That's how serious they took the business. And the people believed it. By 1984, well, actually probably by 85, when Hulkamania exploded, all those other wrestling were off of my television.
Mm.
The only thing I was getting was WWF and the ESPN feed of Vern's AWA show, which by that time was dying. And those other territories were still in existence, but the cable networks dropped them.
No, Vince bought him out.
And as a kid,
cable network not to show it. That's the difference.
But even as an early teenager, kid into my teens, every kid I knew, we all watched wrestling, but none of us believed it was real that grew up on the WWF.
Yeah, I have to say the same. My own experience as a kid watching wrestling in the 80s, there really never was a time where I thought what I was watching was quote unquote real. I mean, I didn't know how it worked. There would be things where I would go, oh, I wonder if that was real. Oh, I don't know. Maybe some of it's real, but I never had this illusion or anything. And I think, and I've said this on my own show too, but I think part of the reason is I had a huge wrestling fan in my family who got me into wrestling. It was my uncle. My uncle was in theater. My uncle was a performer, okay, in live theater. And he loved it. He loved wrestling because of the performance aspect. So he had this very kind of sophisticated attitude towards it. Like he appreciated them. And even back in the 70s, he appreciated them as performers. Like he would see these very intense like angles, where people were supposed to get furious. And he would be laughing, but not because he thought it was stupid. He was laughing because he thought it was brilliant. He thought it was so good what they were doing, but he completely saw through it. And so because I was learning with him, I always looked at it as entertainment and show business in a way, because that's how I actually got into it. And, from him.
But like I said in my book, I dedicated it to my older brother, who showed me how real wrestling was by putting me in the figure 4 leg lock when I was 8.
We all did that, right? I think we can all safely say we've put someone in or been put in the figure 4 leg lock.
You said that on the East Coast, they'd knock your teeth out because they believed it.
Yeah, but my uncle didn't.
Loved it. And
right?
Yeah, there were some things that's like, you kind of like let that one slide, but it was put on to the point where you could believe it. It wasn't stupid and ridiculous. If you got hit with a chair, that was it. It was done.
Right.
You didn't go get a mall.
But Bully Ray Dudley says this all the time. The guys of today don't do what the old guys did: register and sell. Lay down.
Right.
You get hit by a punch, lay down, sell it.
Yeah, would anybody survive any of the matches of today?
Yes.
Well, that's why they were so careful back then. Like you're saying, a chair shot, that should be the end. I mean, the reason they were protecting these things is because they were so scared that people would stop believing. Whereas that's not a concern anymore. So now you can have Triple H hit somebody in the head with a sledgehammer and no one is going like, oh my God, I think he killed that guy. Like we better, get the police in here, because they completely understand that that's not what they're watching this for. It's out the window. But back then they had to be so careful. Like when Harley Race passed away, I did a whole obituary on him and I went back and watched all his title wins and things like this. And I'm trying to remember, I think when he beat Dory Funk Jr. for his first title, I may have the match totally wrong, he beat him with a suplex, just a suplex.
Yep.
You would never see that in a match today. A suplex is a setup move. But of course, the way they were thinking back then is if you really gave someone a suplex for real and they weren't expecting it and you lifted them up and slammed them in that way, you better believe that you would be able to cover them for 3. They would be out of it for a good few minutes at least. But they're just not thinking that way anymore. They're just thinking of it now as spectacle, as a visual spectacle. They're not thinking of the reality of what would these things really do to people if it was really done.
All the 70s finishers, the 70s finishers of the territories, like the superplex by Super Destroyer, for example, Bill Eadie, they are now mere transition moves. It really breaks my heart to see that. Clothesline, Stan Hansen, Lariato, one of those, end of match. Now
the DDT. What about the DDT?
Super kicks, or the claw. He's talking about the claw there.
I mean, I grew up with Jake the Snake. The DDT, you were dead. You were just dead. That was it. The match was over. Your week was over. Now it's just another move, DDT.
I love AEW. I don't fast forward a second of it, but somebody did the other night. I won't say who. It was a DDT spinning off the top rope, and the guy sold it for 2 seconds.
Right.
That's dead.
Yeah. I like their show too, but they are the worst offenders of that.
They've rejuvenated wrestling. Very quickly, the most weirdest Styles Clash matches ever shot in the territories. Honolulu, Blassie against Billy Robinson. Fred wouldn't sell for Billy. Billy got pissed in the main event for the gold belt, the Ring Magazine gold belt. That was their world championship there, a magazine title. Tom Burke, our Tom Burke historian, he was the editor, my boss there, and John Arizzi's boss at Ring Magazine. Again, Blassie, weirdest Styles Clash match. He only went to visit family. I happened to be in Atlanta visiting my own family. It was Christmas of '74. Blassie against Bill Watts. Fred again wouldn't take a bump or hardly sold for Bill Watts. Bill got pissed. And Fred was the face, but Bill really got pissed.
Wow.
And
I don't know if I would want to be no selling for Billy Robinson. I don't know what Freddie was thinking. Good grief.
Well, he hadn't talked to Peter Mavia about that. A little more infamous thing. Jonathan, I know we're probably getting close to the close. We should let everybody talk. Just mention their podcast. Or Jonathan, you're the boss. You better take the lead.
Well, I say before that, Jonathan, do we have any questions from any viewers or anything?
Well, we don't. I asked the viewers, but I would like to start off as we close with Bertrand, because I know he's got another appointment. So, sir, I know you said you did a recent book. So anything you would like to plug, then we will go to Mr. Solomon.
Bertrand,
you got to mute.
Bertrand is asking you to plug everything you'd love to plug.
Well, everything that I need to plug is that the book for Andre the Giant is still out there, second printing. So, Eighth Wonder of the World by ECW Press. The book I did with Pat Patterson, Accepted, is still available also through ECW Press. The Mad Dog Vachon biography. And the original Mad Dog's Midgets and Screwjob. If you want to learn about one specific territory, we have 100 years of Montreal wrestling right there. So that I think that's one of the best way to end this. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great.
Wait! What are those 2 frame photos behind your left shoulder? 2 frame photos up there. Are those the Rougeos, Jacques and Raymond, or
no? It's actually my brother and my best friend when they were a tag team.
Bertrand, I just want to tell you a quick thing before you go. I know you got to go. This is just for you before I plug anything. I was just at CAC. I think I might be the only person here that was there. But when they, in recognition of Pat Patterson, when we were having the buffet on the first night, the buffet dinner, they played Pat singing karaoke. They had like a whole playlist. I don't know where they got this from.
It's his CD. He had a CD.
Oh, okay. That was it then. My Way, of course, was one of them, but there were many other songs. And they played this while we were having dinner. So I thought you would like to know that. It was very sweet.
Pat, for about 6 years in a row, because I've been there since 86. I didn't go to the last two because of COVID. And I take care of 96-year-old. But Pat would lead at the very end of our CAC, the last night, the Wednesday night awards banquet night. He would lead everybody either singing My Way, Sinatra, or What a Wonderful World, Louis Armstrong. So yes. Pat would always lead it. And when I would bring Pat out to some small fan fest in California, he stole the show from an entire wrestling fan convention with guys like Bret Hart and Tommy Dreamer and all that. He would sing live. He'd have his backup CD, but I have two of them. He has two CDs with like 12 songs on each that he released to him doing karaoke, which is why when he wasn't being called in by Vince Sr. for TV and pay-per-views, he was on, once Louis Dandero died, his partner, he was on cruises where he went on the cruises just to sing karaoke. He was that into it and he loved it. And he had a great voice. I bet that's what they played was him recorded, well, probably just straight from the CD.
Yeah, I think it was. Well, just wanted to tell you that, Bertrand.
He did do the CDs for his own pleasure, and he loved giving those away. And he went into a studio by himself to do it, and so that he would have loved that. He was dreaming of doing a show at the CEC in the last few years that we were there together. So I'm sure he was very happy about the homage there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Cheers.
Thank you, Bertrand.
Mr. Sullivan, I know you got a time constraint too, so
yeah, I have a 5-year-old, which my wife has been taking responsibility for
bastard
for longer than I think she wanted to be. So no, but there's my book, of course. There's Blood and Fire: The Unbelievable Real Life Story of Wrestling's Original Sheik. I keep plugging that. It's there's a digital, print, and audio version. And the audio book version, I narrate as well. I was so glad that I got a chance to do that and not have somebody else who would just mess up everybody's names and all that stuff. But and from what I understand, the audio version is actually selling the best. So I guess, I don't know, people people prefer it. But whatever. Royalty is a royalty. So
is it on Audible? Can we listen to it?
Yes, it's on Audible. It's on Audible or even through Amazon, because Amazon has a partnership with Audible. You can get the Audible version through there. There's my podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle, which is through the Arcadian Vanguard Network, which carries the Cornette shows, the great Brian Last, the 605 Super Podcast. So people that love old school wrestling, they already know that brand, but I've been blessed to have great old school themed guests on there. I just had Sheldon Goldberg, who I hope is doing okay. We got to talk at CAC, longtime New England promoter. I just did one today, which is going to run with Herb Simmons, the longtime promoter in Illinois and Missouri. But I've had RVD on there. I've had Blue Meanie on there. So many. I had Jeff Walton on there. I mean, I've done almost 40 of them now. Shut Up and Wrestle's the name. And we also just started the Wrestling News. You mentioned Norm Keitzer. So Brian Last owns the Wrestling News. He owns Wrestling Review. He bought all of it from Brian Bucantis, and he has revived the Wrestling News in a different format. It's now a weekly morning newscast, like a 10-15 minute podcast where we do it straight up NPR style, except it's wrestling. We do reports on business globally, Lucha, Japan, United States, all the major companies, and we really try to treat it very journalistically, very seriously. And it's at thewrestlingnews.com. Yeah. Well, it's weird because you would think it's the most basic, simple idea in the world, but it feels like no one else is doing it, where we insert, there's no opinion. We're not trying to get ourselves over as characters or anything like that. It's just straight ahead. And I write most of the scripts, and I'm a teacher of journalism. So I'm trying to do it in a very journalistic style, and it's been fantastic so far. It's been a joy to do.
A collection of those, and I love them from the 70s.
Yeah. The original Wrestling News. We still use the same logo. In fact, I have it over here somewhere, but we still use the same
format
logo
for most of the programs before they changed the style over.
Well, Kaiser and Jim Melby, they ended up doing the programs for everybody. Us in LA, Vince Sr., Vern, Watts, and Goulas. They ended up producing the programs in the 70s for territories, most all the territories. It was insane for a little while. It was a big deal. Besides their magazines, all their titles on the newsstands every month, Brian.
Yeah, I talked to Norm about that once, and he would tell he had a great relationship with Vince Sr. They would use his facilities, whenever they needed. Like he told me, even sometimes if Vince said, "Hey, we want to do a poster. We just want to do like there's that great poster of Bruno and Backlund together where they're shaking hands in front of the locker room doors." And that was Kaiser printed those up for Vince because they didn't really have the ability to print out their own stuff. They didn't have the in-house kind of infrastructure to do it. So they needed somebody like him. And he had these great relationships until he didn't anymore. And then suddenly everything changed and he was out in the cold. Things changed.
But he and Jim were the kings for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to get
Sullivan.
going myself
Thank you,
too
sir.
then, guys. Thank you so much for having me on.
Nikita.
Greatly appreciate
Brian,
it.
wait 1 minute.
Sure.
All right, because I got to get running too, but I want to say thank you so much for having me on. This is great. It was such a pleasure talking to all of you. Everybody should go out and buy the Wrestlers, Masters of the Craft Professional Wrestling. And after they buy that, get Brian's Blood and Fire, because that book on the Sheik, seriously, 2 sittings,
Greatest
read the whole
heel
thing.
ever. Greatest heel internationally, Japan, Mexico, wherever he went, Canada. There was nobody more colorful than the Sheik, who scared the fans before Brody ever was, even born. The Sheik, I cannot say enough about him because he was just brilliant. And I don't care.
And that book I was looking so forward to. I thought I was going to savor it, and no, I read it in two sittings.
Well, thank you, Brian. And we're gonna have to talk more offline. I don't know if we're friends on Facebook, but I'll have to reach out, even from the boxing side of things, because my family was in boxing for generations. My grandfather was a Golden Gloves fighter and coach in the New York area for decades. He was the cousin of Lou Salika, the bantamweight champion in the 30s and 40s, first cousin. So his name was Salika too. So like boxing is in my family's history. So we'll have to talk.
We'll do each other's shows. I'm the co-host of Transatlantic History Ramblings, a history podcast. You are welcome on any time.
Thank you. I would do that in a second. I'll reach out.
Absolutely. And I want to say, again, this has been such a pleasure. This panel is just such a great group of people. And wrestling is a very special field. My whole life have been a historian, and I'm what they call a hard historian. I do specializing in Victorian crime and Victorian poverty and, hard history. And yet the most attention I've ever gotten for anything I've ever done was a wrestling book. And I was an outsider to the business. I was a fan as a kid, but came in as a historian for this project because my co-author, the great Dan Murphy, is
love Dan,
as big a wrestling guy as there is in the world, and we grew up together. So it's just we happened to grow up together. We've been friends since we were kids.
Dan, I spoke to at length.
And a historian.
Yeah, we spoke at length at CAC. We hung out most of those couple of days. Dan ran the nostalgia room, so he helped me get my table set up and everything. He's great.
He's an amazing guy, and his love for the business is just unreal. And being brought in as a historian and a writer to work on this book just rekindled my love and respect for the business. And like I said, of all the hard history I've done, the most attention and the most love I've ever gotten from anything was for this wrestling book. And it just shows everybody out there, don't be embarrassed. The world loves wrestling, and it's a very special sport, and I will call it a sport.
Brian, all of you guys, because I got to go too. The Big Mouth's got to go. Debbie Harry was on the Tonight Show with Fallon last Friday, and I had to tell Meltzer and all these people, they had no clue. She talked for about 5 minutes. She has a new box set of Blondie, and they have reproductions of just photos that she likes in this box set of all the years of Blondie. One of them is a photo from Ring Wrestling, Tom Burke's publication, with her and Andre backstage at MSG. I think George took that photo. And she talked about that. She talked about Andre. She said she had one of her best girlfriends did PR either for the State Athletic Commission or MSG or Vince Sr. himself. And she said she got free tickets, and she and her husband, forget what his name was, of Blondie, Chris Stein, would like hundreds of Tri-WF shows. And then she talked about her and Andy Kaufman. They showed another photo of her like putting a leg lock on Andy Kaufman, if any of you guys saw it. This was just last Friday. And she talked about she and Andy co-producing T-Neck Tansy, an off-Broadway play that Brian may remember, or Nikita, and it died after its opening night, but it was a big deal for us. All of us were talking about it because we barely got any, in the territory days, any mention of wrestling other than Gorgeous George or Gene LaBelle on Jack Benny's show, or Andre on The Tonight Show when Carson wasn't there and it was Mike Douglas, I think, instead. Or, of course, all the PR leading up to Enoki Ali, where at the Chicago one, not the famous Vince Sr. taping with Monsoon and Ali, but at the Chicago one, Blassie and Gagne coming into the ring together. We were losing our collective minds over that because they had no rapport, hated each other, Fred Blassie and Vern Gagne, but there they are on TV standing a foot apart in the ring with Ali, and I think it was Buddy Wolf who was doing the job for Ali, and before the Monsoon Ali thing, which I forget who was he facing, you guys? Who was
Baron
Cicluna, yeah.
And then Monsoon came into it, and airplanes.
That's where Monsoon gave his famous line that Ali wouldn't know a wrist lock from a wristwatch.
Nice.
And also, back to Debbie Harry. Don't forget.
Everybody. Yeah, so kudos to Debbie Harry. She said she still loves wrestling, as does Cyndi Lauper, so many celebs, Danny DeVito, and all those guys, Andy Warhol, who were at WrestleMania 1, who they threw on camera with Okerlund. It was like a deer in the headlights with poor Andy
That's great.
Standing there with Gene Okerlund.
And my last comment before I got to run.
I'm sorry?
My last comment before I got to run is also with Debbie. One of the most famous pictures of her is her wearing her Dr. X t-shirt. Dr. X, the Destroyer, the great Dick Beyer from the greatest city in the world, Buffalo, New York.
Right.
Yeah, she wear it on stage. All right, I'm going to head out now, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I hope to talk to you all soon. Have a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Nikita and Dr. Mike, do you guys have anything you'd like to plug?
No, listen to Crazy Train Radio with me and Jonathan, and I hope we do another panel like this soon, because this was like we just scratched the surface of how wonderful the territories were.
And this book, When It Was Real, is all about what we're talking about tonight.
My brother Nikita, love you. I will talk to you.
The same, Dr. Mike. You're my brother.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, everybody involved.
Our pleasure.
Wow! Thinking your day is bad and really looking to make it worse? Why not try downloading this new classic set of music that will be dropping so far off the charts, there's bound to be injuries. Now that's what I call depressing. It's gonna make those who are even close to having the slightest glimmer of hope want to jump off the highest of planks. For those that are getting Now That's What I Call Depressing, you'll be getting that song that reminds you of that relationship with those cougars, Wrinkled Ladies. For those who weren't really into cougars, but those who had that special friend whilst in cell block 2B, we got for you this clusterfuck that will put you in therapy for years to come. With cheeks wide open. Who the fuck writes this shit? Oh hell, we're still recording this commercial.
Always with you, it cannot be done.
Those that rather have it out than in. This loaded hit will be dropping soon, farthing in the USA. For those who place their order by calling or ordering online, the next 100 folks will receive their choice of either a noose of good quality that won't snap, an installation of a new outlet next to your bathtub so you can now blow dry your hair in a full tub. Or the choice of the right gang to just beat the fuck out of you. Call us today at 1-800-FUCK-THIS.
Excuse me! This is Vicky Guerrero, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.